Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another Saving Elephants live stream. We've got a wonderful panel this evening, but a small one. We had some last-minute cancellations, but that's okay. We're going to soldier on with Mike Taylor and Christopher Chesney, both who have been on these panel discussions before, but neither of them have been on one together. Tonight's subject, of course, Donald Trump has completed his first year of his second term. I don't know that we really have a word for whatever that is when you don't serve a consecutive term. But he's been in office now for a full year in this second term, and we have thoughts. I'm sure everybody has noticed this has been a busy year. Lots have gone on, and we wanted to reflect on what has been going on over these last more than 365 days, because it's been a little bit since that first year passed. I want to start off, though, with a kind of a question as to what surprised us the most in this first year. And I'll even go so far as to say what you gentlemen were expecting that maybe you got wrong, or at least your expectations were not met. Donald Trump was president for 4 years. So a lot of us, I think, kind of went into the second term thinking, oh, okay, we kind of know what we're going to get. I think some others had more the notion of, well, what we're going to get in the second term is going to be very different than the first, because he's made it clear he doesn't want those similar constraints. I would say, just as, and I'm going to say it very in brief, the two areas where I was possibly the most surprised was I did not realize the degree and the speed with which the Trump administration would be able to effectively deal with the immigration issue as wide as they had, and chiefly through an executive order. We can have a conversation whether or not that even makes sense. 3 years from now, is that all going to be erased with a Democratic or another administration? But he has been far more effective at it than I thought just the executive branch could have been. And secondly, I was honestly surprised the degree to which in this Trump administration has focused more on a American expansionism in a manner that we really didn't see as much, in my view, in the first administration. From things as simple as changing the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and then the attempts to meddle in Venezuela and Greenland. I have various different opinions on those two countries. But those were the two areas I was kind of surprised. But I wanted to open up to you, gentlemen. Where were the areas where you're like, I honestly was a little surprised about those?
I guess I'll start off. Well, thank you so much for having me, Josh. Wonderful. You have a wonderful program, and you're a good friend. And it's a privilege to be back on the Saving Elephants podcast. Before we even get to policy, I'll admit not much has surprised me. I want to start with a mirror, not of my own making, but one held up by Rick Wilson, a former Republican strategist and a member of the Lincoln Project. Had Rick Wilson as a guest on my platform, The Political Mic, twice. Check out episode 158 and 120. Their ad wasn't a prediction. They had an ad called Aftermath during the course of the 2024 campaign. And if you listen to the words of this ad, a lot of folks were saying, oh, this hyperbolic, that's, a little extreme. But their ad wasn't a prediction so much as a warning label. The ad predicted very much what we see now: militarization of authorities, the disregard of the rule of law as it pertains to federal court orders. And it asked a simple question Americans have been asking for nearly a decade. What did you once think was impossible? And whether you think that it's still impossible. The first year of President Trump's second term, whether you view it as a restoration or as a rupture, has been defined less by surprise to me and more by velocity, the pace of executive action, the willingness to test constitutional guardrails, the normalization of once unthinkable debates. You mentioned the acquiring of Greenland. Who thought we would have been discussing this on the Elephants podcast just this time, in 2024? These kinds of things have fundamentally altered the political atmosphere. And so the country isn't just arguing about policies, it's arguing about the rules of the game. It's arguing about the very fabric of what makes the American experiment run. And, independent trackers estimate that Trump has already implemented or begun implementing over 80% of Project 2025's public land agenda and roughly 70% of its fossil fuel priorities. These folks have put out a playbook, and it's amazing to me how many people did not take the playbook seriously. Because if you look at it, many of the things that we're experiencing today, whether it be ICE raids in democratic cities, or swift deportations of folks without due process of law, many of these things were already alluded to in this particular plan. At home, we're seeing how visceral the change from administration to this new administration has been. And these ICE raids are not just tough enforcement; they're a campaign of saturation. New data shows that ICE arrests surged this past year, 2025, with some communities watching arrests triple compared with the pre-Trump period, and Asian immigrants in particular saw arrests jump from about 1,000 to more than 3,700 in just 6 months. And these raids are already, look, they're hitting workplaces, farms, college campuses, private homes. We've seen images of a 5-year-old child being used as a lure. We've seen folks like Alex Peretti, who was involved in protesting, getting gunned down, although he was in a position of surrender. We saw a woman, Renee Nicole Good, literally, cutting the wheel to the right away from the agent and saying, "I'm not mad at you," and yet she was killed. And yet you have the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and the White House telling you don't believe what you saw with your own eyes. Those are the kind of things to me that are reminiscent of the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 50s. The government would literally lie to your face. And fortunately, we're in an age of everyone having their own phones, so we could see for ourselves and make our own judgment, which is what's prompting the swift shift in gears by the White House by replacing the head of the operations in Minnesota with Homan. And so I won't get into any more detail. I'm sure we're going to have enough time to do that in the course of this program. But I think, to me personally, there's not much to be surprised about when you actually looked at Project 2025 and compare it to what we're looking at now. Oh, Josh, you're muted.
Sorry about that, guys. I was going to say, Christopher, you're welcome to respond to that. We will, as he had mentioned, probably get into a lot of those specifics throughout the course of the conversation. But just as a reminder, if you would, what areas were you surprised about in this, let's say, Trump 2.0?
There's been a couple of things. He mentioned Project 2025, admittedly more in the negative. I look at it more on the positive. Issues that Heritage is having notwithstanding over the last 4 months, and they're considerable. I don't need to go into them here.
That's an entire other podcast conversation.
Yes, indeed. And we've spoken about that offline as well. But setting aside everything that's happened with Heritage, it was actually the most acted upon version of that. They've been doing it, I think, since 80-81 that they've had. And I think I mentioned this on the podcast several months or a year ago when I was last on, that I was eminently happy if they got even 40% of that, and they're getting above that on most of that stuff, especially energy policy. My dad's in the oil business. I grew up around oil and natural gas all my life, as have all my brothers and family. I know how much of a feast or famine business it has been. The last 20 years with the rise of the fracking revolution has been, to my mind, one of the best things to happen to this country as far as the oil business, because it had been on a pretty much a downward slope the last for about 25 years before that, and it revived the industry. We're now exporting again. We're now doing various and sundry things on that score that allows us to be a player globally instead of just being an importer. So that's good. And with Trump getting in both the first time and especially this time, him enacting that and opening up everything for business and allowing for free flow out and in, and using that as a leverage point for negotiation, I don't mind that at all. From a national security standpoint, or just from a domestic energy policy standpoint, I think that's eminently a good thing. And you cannot convince me otherwise for a litany of reasons. But setting that one aside, and I also fully expected that. He just has done it with more gusto, which I'm glad about. Tax policy, I fully expected to have happen what happened. Some iterations, some quibbles with certain aspects of it notwithstanding, about what I expected. And we got what we got with expanding school choice and having that become a national policy of some kind that can now spread beyond just being a state by state question. It's still state by state, but the feds have provided a platform that allows for it to go fully national, which I think is going to change some of the game beyond what's already been happening since COVID, with the rise of vouchers, ESAs, everything with school choice and all the various iterations thereof. Josh, I know you're a homeschool kid, and this is even playing into some of the homeschool side of this, both at the state and now federal level, for allowing for some money to come back in either tax credit or tax refund format, depending on state and depending on how the feds get everything finalized over the course of this year. There's been, at least according to official statistics, I think this last quarter clocked in at around 5% economic growth, and that's despite immigration basically coming to a halt, especially illegal immigration. I expected it was going to get shut down. I didn't think it would get quite that quickly, but again, I'm not complaining about the shutdown at the border itself. And I will concede that it's been harder crackdowns in various blue cities across the country, more than I expected as far as quickness, and some would call it severity, but it's there. I fully recognize there's issues going on in Minneapolis that are being addressed in as we speak right now. There's negotiations going on with spending bill for the rest of fiscal 2026 in 2027 that's being dealt with as we speak, that is dealing with some of that, and how that's going to be, how some of those raids are going to be going on going forward. But I believe the numbers have shown that we had a net decrease in migration for the first time in, I think, at least 50 years, if not longer. And nobody really had that on their bingo card, even with factoring in H-1Bs and some of the skilled migration that's still been allowed in, admittedly at a lower scale. But the complete closure of the southern border has been another, I would call, success, and something that a lot of people predicted, but to the good. That had been a longstanding conservative bugbear that people didn't think that the first Trump administration dealt with, and definitely wasn't dealt with under Reagan very well. You had the amnesty of '86, and then you had the HW with his last immigration bill, and then W on his 8 years didn't really handle it very well either, according to a lot on the right, and it was a big thing during the Tea Party era as well. So it finally happened. And so you have those different cross currents. One thing that I would say that has been a little minor disappointment, but it's kind of an afterthought in a lot of people's minds, is some aspects of parts of labor policy seem to have gotten short shrift, but that's for some of that comes down to vagaries in Senate committee membership and certain members of the Republican Party holding things hostage until things get forced. But on the flip side, aspects of federal labor policy vis-a-vis federal workforce, and using the national security exception of the Federal Labor Relations Act of 1978 to disestablish, I believe, 2/3 to 3/4, depending on the metric you use, of federal unions across the federal government. That's a considerable change, again, personally for me, for the better. That also fulfilled Project 2025 that I am personally happy with, because I'm personally of the mind that public sector unionization is FDR didn't like it because there was nobody to be able to negotiate on behalf of the taxpayer when you have both sides negotiating from the same side of the table, and being able to tie the hands of the taxpayer with no ability to opt out. Nothing good comes of that. And it's even worse at lower levels of the government, but even the feds have some aspect of that we didn't like, or that I personally didn't like and care for. And that's a big reach that Trump has. It's now in the courts, but it's looking pretty good that might be given official sanction by the Supreme Court. I think it was also mentioned aspects of citizenship orders and some other executive orders that are coming down. A lot of these, a good chunk of them were re-ups of what he did in the first term. The second, some of them are new that we're dealing with. And there was also extensive use of CRAs, especially on the energy sector side, that we could be seeing. But as far as citizenship and other aspects, that'll be some of the big tells of what comes down the pike. As far as potential legacy going forward, potential retirements after this Supreme Court term might be one of the other things that might help further solidify it. He already got 3 nominees his last time up, and we'll see what happens potentially with either Alito or Thomas, depending on if they want to go this time or if they want to wait until 27 and 28, depending on the results of the Senate. Time will tell, but that would be another thing that could potentially solidify that. But as of right now, SCOTUS has been solidifying a lot of what he's done. And one of the big remaining cases that that'll be coming up is probably that I'm blanking on it, birthright citizenship and adjudicating the extent of how the ARC decision of 1898 goes, because that could be read, strictly speaking, for citizens and permanent residents who have green cards. But there's been adjudication since, and well, we'll see how that goes, but that's to be determined. But I'm much more on the positive side that a lot of stuff that he said was going to be happening is happening. Disappointments, I would say, on the pro-life side, there has been some disappointments that have been very much echoed through some of the healthcare fights, going back to the government shutdown and aspects of not just birth control pills, but abortifacient pills that have caused no small amount of consternation amongst various sections of the pro-life community. That's been a disappointment that a lot of people are echoing. So that's something that it's not going to surprise people that I have some disappointment in as well. But I also know that it's a touchy issue that might be part of the reason why he's playing a middle ground on that, or at least he thinks he is. Whether he's achieving it or not is entirely in the eye of the electoral beholder.
So each of you obviously are very gifted at recalling a lot of the happenings over this past year as far as policy decisions go and the direction of the administration. In order to hopefully facilitate a conversation, I want to turn to it was toward the beginning of Trump's second term that Yuval Levin, who I've had the great privilege of having on my podcast a couple of times actually, had made this observation, and he may not have been the only one, but he was the one I remember making the strongest case for it. Talking about how, like, at the time there was a perception that the Trump administration was moving with insane speed, and it was doing inroads and kind of circles around the left, broadly speaking, to the point that it caused much distress among Democrats. And what Levin said was that this is actually not that unprecedented. We've kind of lost this muscle memory for this is how oftentimes the beginning of an administration looks. Now, it's a little different in this case because we're talking about the second administration. We're talking about there's a 4-year gap, which is very unusual in our history. But he recalled Barack Obama when he was first elected and the speed with which they were able to move having Congress. He also mentioned that a lot of the ways in which the Trump administration was in fact doing things was through executive orders, And so there was this sort of perception that this next 4 years was just going to be one insanity after another. Now, I say this in light of the fact, yes, I recognize recent events in Venezuela, in Greenland, and in Minneapolis have us all talking. But I also think Levin was somewhat vindicated that the latter part of this year slowed down considerably from the beginning. There was only so much low hanging fruit as far as executive orders go. And the only real landmark legislation was the big, beautiful bill. Beyond that, it looks like the administration is, I don't want to say running out of steam, because there's a lot at, say, like an international foreign policy level that could still be done, a lot through appointments and judicial appointments, certainly. Remains to be seen whether or not Republicans hold Congress after the midterm elections. But whether or not they do, this appears to be an administration that has very little appetite or even interest in trying to cement their policy victories through a legislative process. Is that something you gentlemen would agree with? And if so or if not, what are the consequences of that? Like, are we looking at something that began with a neck break speed in the first year of an administration, and then the next 3 years it may just sort of putter on and largely be unconsequential because of its inability to get anything over the legislative line?
Yeah, I actually wanted to go in that direction, Josh, because if you recall, around May of 2024, your senator James Langford wrote legislation to address the crisis at the southern border. This particular piece of legislation had a mandatory border shutdown authority. It triggered automatic shutdown and mass expulsions if daily encounters averaged 5,000. So basically, Title 42 on steroids. It ended catch and release. 50,000 new detention beds, more ICE agents and officers, double deportation flights. It's allocated funds towards Trump's border wall, $650 million towards the wall that Trump promised since 10 years ago, 26 or 11 years ago, when he was almost 11 years ago, when he was a candidate for the presidency the first time. It toughened asylum. It raised credible fear bar to Trump's reasonable possibility standard. And the amazing thing to me is how little that piece of legislation has been alluded to since Trump since Trump admittedly called folks from Congress to tell them not to vote for it. This piece of legislation, to me, was a signal that the Republican Party had won on the issue of immigration, because you had Democrats willing to support this bill. And I challenged folks on my show and on yours. I said, tell me which one of these items is a Democratic, dream. None of these things are, things that Democrats would love to go back to their districts and say, proudly, I supported this. But they were willing to do it because they understood the fact that that public opinion had indicated that the southern border, that they were convinced the southern border was a problem that was out of control, and that something needed to be done about it. Something drastic and something serious. And so the fact that here we are, starting, year two, and Trump has both chambers of Congress, he has a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and yet not the Langford bill or any other comparable bill has been proposed, to me indicates that it was never really about America first. That's my opinion. This issue has been an effective issue during campaign season. But when it comes down to it, when you have the numbers, and again, I'm judging this administration as I would the Biden administration. If the Biden administration had these numbers and made this a key proposal of their agenda, and still hadn't gotten it done, that's the only, to me, logical explanation. And a lot of folks have been saying, like Christopher, that the border has been sealed. But I just want to push back on that a little bit, because according to the fiscal year 2025 data, 238,000 Southwest encounters occurred, which is 2.3 times higher than Trump's own fiscal year 2020 low. So when you look at October 2025 data, there were 7,989 apprehensions, in addition to 30,000 nationwide. And that still beats Trump's monthly average. And then when you look at June of last year, just a few months back, 6 months ago, there were 6,070 encounters. So this was 70% above Trump's non-COVID lows and double President Obama's quiet months. So the bottom line is that, it's that these southern border encounters have declined since the Biden administration, of course, with the help of Mexico. But Trump's numbers are elevated when you compare them to Bill Clinton's, George W. Bush's, Barack Obama's, or even his own first terms. So, I just wanted to throw that out there because a lot of folks would get the impression that the southern border is completely sealed off. Now, does it mean that progress isn't being made on that front? No, that's not what it means. I'm just putting that out there for context sake. But, as we're talking about legislation, in the big, beautiful bill that was passed this past 4th of July, signed into law this past 4th of July. And I think you were going here too, Josh. A lot of people are going to see the effects of this as we're heading into the 2026 midterms and towards the 2028 general election. Independent studies actually show that 68% of rural hospitals are scheduled to experience a decline in their funding and their resources, which of course would lead to hospital shutdowns, hospice shutdowns. And so folks in rural areas in Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana would find themselves having to travel probably 2 hours to get adequate health care. And so those are some of the things that to me indicate that, on the legislative front, things look rather bleak. But even on a national front, on a worldwide front, Trump to me has trained, and this is according to people who have spent their entire careers in foreign policy, people like Richard Haas, who by no means is a Democrat or a liberal by any sense of the imagination. He has trained the world stage on how to operate without the United States of America. So he's taken a blow to the post-World War II apparatus. And I think you alluded to it earlier in your conversation. When he violated Article 2, subsection 4 of the UN Charter by going in and taking Maduro, when he's acting unilaterally and doing things to offend some of our allies. These are things that are not in alignment with, to me, international interests. Of course, I'm open to hearing other opinions, but you look at the record, and he's pulled the United States out of the Paris Agreement, from the foundational UN Climate Treaty. He's initiated withdrawal from the World Health Organization and dozens of UN and climate-related bodies. He's formally repudiated international tax coordination. And you could tell yourself this is America first. But when the United States voluntarily vacates leadership roles on climate, health, and economic governance, it doesn't end those conversations. It moves them to rooms where we no longer have a vote. Over time, that means less ability to set rules that favor American workers and companies, less influence over how the world responds to crises that inevitably hit our shores, a narrower coalition when we do need partners for real security challenges. And so this is strategic self-weakening on a global stage, and I'll just end my comments there for now.
I think you're muted, Christopher.
Sorry about that. Couple points of potential rejoinder, and as well as coasting and dovetailing from Yuval Levin. We forget a lot of what happened 16 years ago when Obama was moving, and a lot of things that a lot of people forget the thermostatic reaction that happened quite immediately for Obama whenever the Tea Party rose up, literally over the course of those first couple months. I remember us talking about this when you were during your one misbegotten run for elected office. You were kind of picking up the tail end of that in and around Tulsa where we first met. But Trump, to a degree, I could see your point, Mike, but I would say that Trump himself has has at various points called for getting rid of the filibuster to try to get more going. So that's one point that makes me think that he does want to have some of this ensconced into law. The second is they're going full steam ahead on trying to gerrymander, and there's been counter gerrymandering all across the country on trying to address that one way or the other. You have Texas, California, Virginia, where I'm at now is in the middle of a fight about it. There've been fights about it in Missouri, Indiana, big one in Maryland right now, and they're later going to try to do something in Florida. So you have obvious attempts to try to do some solidification, trying to keep a majority in the the House of Representatives, which is more tenuous than the Senate right now. So I would say that there's at least some attempt to try to preserve that, and that doesn't even get into the
but
VRA.
surely, but there's a big difference between gerrymandering and removing the filibuster versus legislative wins, right? You're talking about trying to maintain Republican control, not necessarily trying to
Which
get
would
bills
allow
through.
for even the possibility of either keeping unified control to get some of that. Now, obviously, I personally don't want to get rid of the filibuster. I think that I'm going to say it. It's a bad idea because you want that veto point. How you keep it, that's a whole other topic of discussion that I don't want to get into at this point because that requires inside baseball and where the party's bases are at this point and where things may or may not go. I don't want to get into that for the purpose of this conversation. That's a digression. But for this, you have the VRA fight that might allow for more Republican seats to especially come in around the South, where a lot of the old majority-minority rules that have been around for 40, 50, 60 years for how you do redistricting, that could fortify a Republican majority in the House of Representatives. Maybe not this cycle, depending on when the case comes down out of SCOTUS, but could potentially make a big impact into 2028. And even if Trump lost that, that could be a big hindrance for Democrats to be able to overcome going forward. So that's another thing that there's clearly been a big play, and Trump supported that case to come through to try to do that for trying to help fortify at least the position in the House. Senate, that's its own kettle of fish, but I think he's trying to fight that, and he's been making clear that he wants to do that. There's also a court case on the RNC being able to get rid of coordination rules in the last couple months before an election, and trying to go that route to help even the playing field financially, because Democrats have been raising more in individual campaign levels, but RNC's been doing better. So coordination between campaign committees might also be another thing he's trying to go down on that. So that's one part. As far as immigration's concerned, as far as trying to fortify that, there's been a long time discussion on the right wing on whether you needed another bill. This is going back to Bush. Like, do we need more immigration law on the books, or do we only need what we have? Trump did get the Lake and Riley Act passed earlier this year, so that was one thing. That was actually one small but significant thing that did pass. But beyond that, a big part of what Trump was saying, and a lot of other Republicans on the right wing, especially to the right of Langford, were saying, was that we don't need more legislation. We just need to enforce what's on the books. Mm-hmm. And clearly what's on the books combined with the executive orders enforcing what was already on the books meant that we didn't need anymore. And so you have that. As that would be my rejoinder on that. Another thing you mentioned is there's been interceptions at the border, but there haven't been many gotaways that have gotten beyond the border at this point. And a lot of people that were in country are being taken out in a lot of the, for good and ill, a lot of the raids and whatnot. And again, the numbers don't lie with the amount of people that have actually gotten in. Yes, there are people still attempting to get in, but I don't think they've been very successful. Yeah, they're higher, but they're higher in the attempts, but there's more interceptions. So I think it's, to my mind, a little misleading on some of that. As far as international relations are concerned, I know Buckley, who's one of your heroes and is more or less one of mine, Josh, he was on the, I don't know if it was the Trilateral Commission, but I think he was on the Council of Foreign Relations, and he might have been on the Atlantic Council. I can't remember, but he was one of the more skeptical people consistently on that council during the Cold War and into the post-war period up through when he died. So, and he wasn't very keen. He wasn't. He at least provided voice to some of the people that were more skeptical about the UN even back in the 50s. He wasn't on the Bircher side. He cut them out. That's not news, but he was always skeptical about a lot of the IRs, the international relations going through a lot of these organizations as it is. So Trump is kind of bringing back an older school version of that amongst Republicans that considers a lot of them superfluous. Yeah, some of this negotiation's happening, but without us, but at the same time, if we're the biggest game in town, in some ways the only game in town, and we're choosing to forego, I don't see it as necessarily a net negative that, let's say, Europe is hurting. Europe's increasing forevermore its regulatory state. There's an active effort to try to curtail it. Is it really hurting us that the Europeans are, at least economically, cutting their own throat on a lot of these different things and hindering their ability to have innovation while we're still having the innovation here? And we're negotiating bilateral agreements here, there, and however, there's a lot of discussion about tariffs and how that's been handled, but there's been movement on that for good and ill that's helped drive a lot of the conversation for market access over the last while. So as far as a lot of the international relations are concerned, I was always skeptical about it, even going back to high school, and I've developed more and more skepticism towards playing in the sandbox in a lot of ways with how a lot of these are structured. So I don't consider it a net loss that we're not playing in it, especially in aspects of how climate change has been debated, because I really don't think that's been a net benefit for a lot of the West vis-a-vis how China has more or less ignored that and other parts of the developing world, while there's actually been discussion on part of the reason we're developing energy here is because we do it cleaner than those areas. So it's better to develop it here so we don't have to rely on the dirtier sources of fuel while we still have that time. Elon Musk had mentioned that, and has have several others in that space who try to talk about how do we get to this new form of economy. How much longer do we have to tide over? A lot of people, even in the center lefters, could see we need to stay in that. We need to keep developing. We need to keep developing fossil fuels for the next while to be able to tide over while we get the alternative sources of energy, the greener forms. How green they are is also subject to debate, but those greener forms more and more online without spiking energy prices for the average consumer in the middle and lower middle classes all across the country. You don't want to have what happened in Europe, where in Spain you had a brownout because they converted to such a high amount of renewable that the system couldn't handle it on a particular day. Or you have kind of what's happened in California and a few others that have really shot up. And that's setting aside anything with data centers. That's been a big thing here in Virginia and elsewhere. But I think I've spoken enough on that. I will give back the floor to you, Josh, and to Mike.
Well, once again, it's a challenge to summarize all that or pivot in a different direction, but I think we can do it. Let me on the international point, which is possibly where we should begin. Let's say to land this plane. Christopher, to your point, I think it's fair that there are varying voices on the right that have had different views of what we ought to be up to at an international stage. And William F. Buckley, while he did have his own views, it was not a monolith. Not everyone agreed with him. And further, I think it's entirely fair to say, look, Buckley also had his concerns with certain, to borrow a founding phrase, foreign entangling alliances, if you will. That being said, if we can narrow that focus just a bit, it's one thing to talk about climate policy or the World Health Organization or the degrees in which we are behaving as the leader of the free world in these, say, international bodies. There has been a long bugaboo on the right about the UN, about it's not necessarily something directly affecting us here in the United States, but oftentimes the right pokes fun at the EU and its kind of bureaucratic system. However, I think there is another aspect of this, which is the international order. And this may or may not, this weaves into international organizations, but it also, if we just strip away all organizations whatsoever, there has been a post-World War II consensus that the United States is the leader of the free world. It does not mean we've had consensus on what exactly that means in all cases and who we should or should not be fighting. But generally speaking, we come to the aid of our fellow allies in Western Europe, in parts of Southeast Asia, throughout the world that have essentially been allied with us in both spirit and politics and military alignment for many, many years. I would venture to guess that, and I my biggest concerns at this point about the long-term ramifications of a Trump 2.0 presidency is almost entirely in this area. And I don't mean that there aren't domestic concerns. I don't mean there aren't areas in which, certainly about American ideas of self-governance or how we're defining ourselves at, say, a local level, we can talk about that all day. But when it comes to these international things, I think we're talking about something that would be very difficult for future presidential administrations to put the genie back in the bottle if we as a nation decided this was the wrong direction. Because we don't necessarily get a vote in what our European allies think of us. We don't necessarily get a vote in how other countries choose to structure their alliances if they genuinely believe the United States is no longer a reliable partner. And by reliable partner, I mean someone who can be not so much trusted always to do the right thing, but could at least be trusted to be somewhat consistent in their approaches. And that it's no longer a matter of, well, if this party wins, then they'll back these nation states. And if this party wins, they'll back the other nation states. And I realize we're not quite to that point yet. I'm not trying to imply that. But I do think we're playing a very dangerous game. We can have reasonable debates about whether or not NATO is suiting our purposes or whether or not they're paying their fair share or whether or not it needs to be restructured in some way. But I think those debates have to begin with an understanding of what the point of NATO was, and at least the acknowledgement that the members of the NATO countries are in an alliance against other rogue nations that would cause us ill will. It's the oddest thing to me, the number of times that Donald Trump counts one of the reasons for acquiring Greenland is because they can't defend themselves, that NATO cannot defend itself against China or Russia. We are NATO. We are NATO. It's not some separate entity. It's something that we are the primary contributor and defender and participant in. And it almost seems like much of the American people, and particularly the Trump administration, literally think of this as some sort of another. Maybe NATO could be improved. I'm open to the conversation, but I think the improvement needs to start from sort of a recognition of the last, say, 75 years of international order, and not just sort of a pretending that none of this had ever happened. Anyhow, I'm monologuing myself too, and what are your gentlemen's thoughts on that?
I'll jump in. Trump and Vance's approach to NATO and our European allies and the world stage, to me, doesn't convey skeptical realism, echoing Buckley. To me, it seems like they're actively provoking a transatlantic crisis that weakens the West and emboldens Putin. To me, it's ideological arson on our closest allies. And, when we look at February 2025, coming close to about a year ago, at the Munich Security Conference, Vice President Vance trashed European leaders as bigger threats than Russia or China, accusing them of retreat from quote-unquote fundamental values like free speech, citing Germany's AfD suppression and Romania's election annulment. He pointed to their immigration failures and in censoring figures like Elon Musk. You look at the fact that Trump has been making direct threats, like you alluded to throughout the program, Josh, to bring Greenland into the American fold. This isn't forging multilateralism; he's bullying sovereign allies. Trump renewed his calls to annex Denmark's territory, and this makes the United States a direct threat to NATO ally sovereignty. And the timing couldn't be worse. This is coming at a time when Russia is actively seeking to gain Ukraine. This is exactly what Putin wants. Calling Canada the 51st state. These public musings, they alienate our northern flank, amplifying perceptions of United States imperialism. And the fallout is that the Kremlin is cheering on this rupture of NATO. Europe is scrambling for debt to fund defense, and the timing couldn't have been worse. But you look at even on the World Economic Council, and you see figures like Jay Carney. When you hear Jay Carney, of the Prime Minister of Canada's speech, it really does sound like a speech Kennedy would have given if John F. Kennedy was alive. He said, great powers are using their economic influence as a weapon. We need rules-based trade, not coercion. And he got a standing ovation from attendees. So he kind of fills in that void of what a traditional United States president in the post-World War II era would have said at such a conference. Meanwhile, Trump directly attacked the Canadian Prime Minister, saying that Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that. So this was retaliation for Carney's words. All of this to say, the United States has enjoyed nearly 70 years of this post-World War II era, where we not only were in the room, like you alluded to with NATO, but we set the agenda, we set the tone. All of that is up for grabs now, it seems, with this administration. I would love to see anything that changes course and proves me wrong. But as of right now, as we're looking at a year into this second term of Donald Trump, it seems like all of those things that were once taken for granted, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, all of that now is at risk.
If there was a particular, I will say this, getting purely more into the international side. If there was a thing I really wish he handled differently, I would mention that with Venezuela being a legitimate head, I do not recognize that everybody considered the way he won the election in either late 24 or early 25, a year ago or some such, was illegitimate. This was handled in not quite as clean a way as Panama was 35, 36 years ago, but that was probably the closest analog. And I've also literally never seen a support from Latin America for removal of a seeming head of state be net positive, in a lot of ways more net positive than here. I didn't even think it was going to be that good, and I supported what happened with him, with Maduro being taken out. Just saying that for the purposes of this conversation. Switching this to Canada and the Great White North. Trump, I think, fumbled that. I was for hardball in most circumstances, but the conservatives were supposed to win that race, hands down. Trudeau the younger, or Trudeau the lesser, depending on how you want to call him, had put the Liberal Party into the ditch, and he got a hand up. Carney got a hand up by Trump, and we should have played that better. I am still mad about that to this day. I will grant that 100%. That is one of my biggest disappointments foreign policy-wise. That said, as far as negotiating and cajoling and whatnot, I see a lot of aspects of how the old Washington consensus, especially post-Cold War, on how some of the aspects of how trade were negotiated, where we didn't press our claim or advantage. I see how that has caused no small amount of tension with a lot of domestic people domestically. Now, can you put it back, a lot of that back at the bottle, especially there's been a rise in manufacturing investment, but a lot of the people that work those line jobs, the amount of automation, a lot of people aren't going to necessarily get back to work. That's a whole other part of the debate that's to be considered. Even if we get a lot of that new investment, there's not going to be as many people working the lines. But bringing that back, I still consider, at least to some degree, a net positive as far as the negotiation is concerned. But I still think that Canada, we should have handled better, and it is causing consternation because now they're turning towards China for negotiation and whatnot. Now, do I think some of that's going to eventually redound to their net negative? I still think so, but that's long term, and I think we blew it at the very start of the administration with how that election could have and should have gone. As far as engagement with Europe, I think calling out their free speech issues. UK is not technically part of the EU at this point, although they negotiated an agreement that they're still having to deal with them more than I would like, and they're still in the European Court of Human Rights. That's a whole point of discussion with how Reform is now doing quite well in Britain and how they might rise up to become the new ruling party under Farage, who's now at the tail end of his going on 35 to 40-year career now. I don't think it's the worst idea to, I know it's not couth, but we have been through, during and at the end of the Cold War, we have the National Endowment for Democracies, and you have the International Republican Institute, and I believe the Democrats have their equivalent that supports center-right and center-left parties in different parts of the world, Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia, and I think a little bit in Latin America. We already have some institutionalization already. A lot of people forget that. And how do we steer that? Trump's saying that we don't need to keep it necessarily with the center-right, because, or definitely the center-left, because what constitutes the European governing center is already losing its bearings by jettisoning free speech. And I don't mind what Vance said with calling him out on that particular thing, setting aside anything with defense spending. That's a core civilizational thing that developed in the aftermath of World War II, mass spreading of, especially in Western and Central Europe, free speech, and post-Cold at the end of the Cold War into Eastern Europe, that ability to have that, as well as discussion of civilizational preservation and how they seem to have been asleep at the switch. That's a topic of discussion that I don't think should be out of bounds with this administration or any administration. Winston Churchill talked about the preservation of Western Christendom and Christian civilization during the Second World War. He talked about it even when he became prime minister again, and up through when he passed away in 64 and 65, when he was still just a regular member of parliament. And that got lost. I know Trump isn't a standard bearer of Christianity in any significant way, but Vance has kindled that, and that's been a topic of discussion on the right, and it's something that had been out of bounds that I think should be inbounded, so to speak, now with how this is handled. It's a big key of what's being discussed with Eastern Europe vis-a-vis Western Europe now. Whether you like Hungary or not, that's something that they've been trying to talk about. Poland is having a big fight with its president versus its its parliament, and having discussions on how it could move forward. It had been more solidified in Hungary's direction, and now you're having those discussions in Bulgaria, Romania, and parts of Eastern Europe that had been much less migrant friendly on how far do we steer this train for losing our bearings of what makes Europe Europe. And America is kind of standing in the void like, we're here, yeah, we have our own issues, but we're here trying to stand up for this. Where are you guys giving up on free speech, giving up on the legacy of our civilization? Where are you at? And I think that's an entirely legitimate question for us to be asking ourselves beyond anything with defense, that, yeah, it's causing some turmoil with, and there's some taking advantage of it by Putin and China, but they were going to try to do it. They were going to be trying to do that anyway. It doesn't lessen the fact that we need to address this question. It is a core civilizational discussion that we need to be having across the Anglosphere and across the more generally the West. And I include Eastern Europe in that, especially insofar as they're part of the EU. Like, are we going to preserve the Western civilizational legacy or not? Free speech was one of the last parts of it, but if you start to lose that, you start to go all further down the road, that if you lose that, a whole bunch of other stuff could come down, and given demographic issues that are already present, that's not a road I think they should go down, and that should be part and parcel of how we discuss everything. And I think Trump, and especially Vance, bringing that up, I don't think is a net negative. I think it's something that had been covered up for multiple decades, if not a half century, depending on how you look at it, country by country. And I think that's something that needed to be opened up. So I don't mind that discussion at this point. It might lead to some weakening in the short term, but in the long term, if we could get this settled, I'm not going to complain.
There are too many issues here for us to put a bow on everything, but I do want to give both you gentlemen an opportunity to offer some closing thoughts, and I'll just ask it in the way of, given the year we've been through, what do you think the next three years portends?
I think the next 3 years offers more of the same. To be quite blunt, you know, again, I go back to what I started the conversation with at the top of the hour. These folks put out a playbook. The Heritage Foundation is very, all the authors who contributed to this playbook were very, they weren't just writing for kicks and giggles. They were very much intentional about some of these things that have been monumental. Some of the seismic shifts that we've been seeing on the ground level. And for anyone who is now caught off guard or caught unaware, it just goes to show they were not taking this seriously or were not reading. Of course, this is an election year. So, of course, polls are indicating right now that the headwinds are in the Democrats' favor. A lot can change. I'm old enough to remember 2022 when folks were predicting a red wave. And of course, Biden had the best midterm for any incumbent president going back to Kennedy. So, I'm not comfortable. And again, I tell people, don't get comfortable in polls. Polls, they've misled us before. And so, this particular election really comes down to whether we want to have some checks and balances, whether we want to have a society where the rule of law matters. We've seen, and I alluded to it, I was hoping we'd get into it, Donald Trump, deliberately violate federal court orders with little repercussion at all. No repercussion, actually. Do we want a society where the president of the United States can do that, Democrat or Republican? That's what's on the ballot, and that's what the American people have to decide for themselves. But we're going to see some, I think, more incidents with ICE. This incident with Minneapolis, of course, was one that garnered a lot of traction and quick response from the White House. But there's really no indication that Donald Trump is going to scale back on any of these deportation rates. There's been voices from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party to have Secretary Kristi Noem removed from office. And I'm old enough to remember how Secretary Mayorkas was impeached. I would argue for far, far less. The argument behind his impeachment was that the border was not secure and chaotic. Here, people have died. People have died. And not only that, but, there was, very little organization in terms of how these folks were trained. You have to, it's amazing how you have to have more training as a barber or a hair beautician than an ICE agent. And yet folks' lives are in your hands, right? And so, the next 3 years, they're not hopeless. Like I alluded to, we have the elections, but I'm not expecting to see much of a different tone from this White House. If we do have a Democratic Senate or a Democratic House, or even just one chamber of Congress that's a Democratic Party, expect to see some more hearings into, for instance, the latest incident, the FBI raid into Fulton County's legal offices to look for any kind of evidence to overturn the 2020 election. You could expect to see more hearings where folks like Rusty Bowers, the Republican Speaker of the House of Arizona, who was also one of the star witnesses of the January 6th committee hearings, will be able to testify from firsthand the pressure that they experience to alter and to manipulate the tally of the elections. And so that's what I'm looking forward to. If we do get the majority in the House and the Senate, I'm looking to see more oversight. I'm looking to see some legislation passed on immigration. One of the things that I'm proud that the Democratic Party, I hope to say that the Democratic Party will be willing to do is allow there to be legislation that would count as a win for Donald Trump, but yet addresses the southern border. I think that's shows that we are above the fray compared to the Republican Party, who was willing to tank a Republican authored bill for purely political reasons.
As far as court orders are concerned, I think there are some edge cases on how that's been determined, especially when you get to appeal. But there had been some discussion with people who, I'm not saying you're doing this in bad faith at all, Mike. Believe me, you brought up some good points that I go through a lot of effort to, if not necessarily rebut, but provide counter examples. As far as respecting court orders, I know that there's been a lot of pounding at the district court level, but a lot of stuff has been overturned at the various levels of the appellate courts, either the circuits or especially at SCOTUS. So I'm going to leave that there to for people to consider how much disobeying there has been by the administration. Once you especially consider the appeals court. As far as what to look forward to this year, since it's still, at least as of now, a Republican Congress, I'm looking forward to seeing how some of the primaries go down. I do think that the left wing is particularly animated in a way that it wasn't even in 2018 or 2020, or definitely 22, where as a lot of the old guard retires, there's going to be some pressure, and even on some of the ones that don't, there's going to be some primary victories by people on the left that's going to probably rival what happened in 1974, where the party moves significantly to the left. And should they win the majority in the House of Representatives, I'm definitely expecting impeachment votes fairly regularly, for valid reasons or not, against this administration. So I do fully expect that should they win the House. If they don't, then there could be more puttering. There may be a reconciliation bill 2.0. There's been discussion about that here in DC, about how that goes beyond healthcare or some other topic. There's been some real effort to try to get something going on that, to try to get another part of Trump's platform and another part of his legacy solidified. Whether it can actually happen or not, time will tell, but there's at least going to be some attempt to try to do something along that line, so we aren't just left with the one big beautiful bill. I do expect some of those Supreme Court cases, be it birthright citizenship, or at least the beginnings of the adjudication on how that's to be considered, combined with the VRA case and the RNC case on how campaign finance is going to concern. I know the polls aren't looking good for Republicans, but there could be something that helps jack up participation. We are now in an era of high turnout. Since 2016, we have had in midterms no less than the 40%. I think in 2018 it was cresting 50% for the first time in well over 50 years, if not a century. And then presidentially in 2020, we got as high as we had in 120, and it was only moderately down this last time. We're now in an era like it was in the 60s, where every election is now much more on edge for good and ill to be contested. And I expect we're going to probably have really high turnout again. I expect there's going to be further solidification at the state level of that. There will be some changing of where things go in some of the swing states, and so I expect that's going to probably continue to play out. As far as any other direction, executive directions, I think Trump's going to keep any resignations of any of his staff to a minimum, especially if the Senate gets narrowed or they lose it. I think they'll still keep the Senate. It might be down to 52 or 51, but there could also be a shock. We could gain Michigan to counteract a loss in North Carolina, for example, or Maine. There's also a couple other seats on the board to keep an eye on, but I think that if we get split government like we did in 2018, 2019, it'll probably be a resumption of that, but a much more left-wing Democrat Party, plus a fairly younger Republican Party with some of the retirements that are happening, as well, that causes a changing of the guard. A few of the Freedom Caucus guys are going to become attorney generals potentially. Look at Chip Roy in Texas. Byron Donalds is going to likely become the next governor of Florida. First black Republican governor. There's going to be some potential changes on the horizon with demographic and caucus makeup that could potentially scramble some of the old calculi, political calculi that we've had across the country that continue to scramble some of the coalitions, especially not Hispanics necessarily all across the country, but in Texas and Florida. Where do they go from here? There could be a lot of new voices that come up that change where things go nationally going into 28. And speaking of 28, I think Vance has obviously the inside track. Rubio said he wouldn't run if he runs. I do think you could, this is a little bit more speculative, but given certain divisions that have become more apparent on the right vis-a-vis Iran, Venezuela, aspects of Israeli foreign policy and Iranian foreign policy, and everything else going forward, that might be the part that raises its head in 27 and 28. That's going to be worth keeping an eye on. Where do things go from here on the right? Like, there are aspects of how you could claim Trump on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
How does that play out? I think that some of the election results this year will be telling on where that goes. And it's going to be really fun, for good and ill, to see that on the right. On the left, like I said, I think the more insurgent wing and the left wing will rise and supplant a lot more of the more moderate leadership that had been there, relative as it might have been. Steny Hoyer is going to get replaced by somebody to his left. I'm positive of that. In Maryland, somebody's going to probably be to the left of Pelosi. In San Francisco, just as two examples. You could point to myriad others. And some of the Senate classes coming up that's challenging, that's younger and generally more left-wing. Look at Maine with Plattner versus the sitting governor. Look at Michigan, where you have a fight between more establishment versus two strains of liberalism veering into leftism in the case of another candidate. And you have dogfights in some of the early primaries already happening in Texas and in Illinois right now. And that could set the stage for what happens with the primaries going later into the summer. So that's what I'm looking forward to seeing beyond anything policy-wise. Josh, do you have any thoughts on where you think things might go? I know you've been mostly facilitator, but I think you might have ideas on where things might go to wrap up.
I do. I was thinking about just wrapping it up here completely. So much of it to me hinges on how the outcome of the 2026 election. I do think it's true that should the Democrats take at least the House, it would be hard to go a solid 2 years into the last 2 years of Trump's administration without another impeachment hearing and possible impeachment hearings of the various members of the cabinet. Just because I cannot imagine 2 solid years would go by and nothing would rear its head to the point that the Democratic Party felt like, we got to begin impeachment hearings over this. I'm honestly, I'm just going to leave there. We've got so many things on the table that I would hope the audience would chew on those. And I do appreciate you giving me the opportunity, Christopher. I maybe I'll come up with an episode where I really sit and think about what I think the next 3 years portend. Guessing the future is always a dangerous game, and I have a pretty poor record. But I do want to thank both of you gentlemen for coming on, for offering divergent views for the audience, and I think that's very appreciated. I think if nothing else, it helps us. It keeps us honest and it keeps us thinking, and it keeps us. I think it makes us sharper, even to hear people we strongly disagree with. I really think over the long term that makes our own views better. Here on Saving Elephants, obviously we have an angle, a very conservative angle, but I like occasionally being able to offer alternative perspectives. And with that, I thank everyone for watching, and we will see you guys next time.